Good evening, everyone, and thanks for joining us for the webinar this evening, where we'll be discussing the basics of nutrient management and planning ahead for the next grazing season. My name is Chloe McKean, I'm the Knowledge Transfer Officer for Beef and Lamb, and tonight we'll hear from Siwan Howatson and James Holmes. Siwan has worked with us as our grass and forage scientist for 4 years, and James is our resource management scientist, having worked at AHDB for 12 years. So the plan of action this evening is that James and Siwan will take us through a 30-minute presentation, and there'll be some polls throughout, so please do join in. I'll also take any questions throughout as well, and then there'll also be time to go through more questions at the end. If you think of a question, you can type it into the questions box at any time. This box usually sits on the right-hand side of your screen, and if you can't see this box, you may need to press on the orange arrow to open this box up. If you then click on the questions drop-down, you'll see where you can type your question in. As usual, you will all be muted throughout the webinar, so please let us know if you're having any technical problems and we'll do our best to help. So just let us know if you've got any problems and type this into the questions box as well. Usual advice is to log out and back in again. So Siwan, I'll hand over to you to run through the objectives for tonight's webinar.
Thanks, Chloe, for introducing tonight's webinar. So before we kick off with our first poll, I would just like to quickly run through what the aims are for tonight. So by the end of the session, you will understand the benefits of how to create a nutrient management plan for grassland and have a good overview of what tools are available to help you do this. Recognise how to use the principles of nitrogen management to your advantage on your own farm, and also identify how to get the most out of milk and slurry. So to kick off tonight, before we head into the benefits section, I'd like to launch the first poll, which is, do you have a nutrient management plan? So I'll give you a few more seconds to answer that poll. I can't see how many have answered, Chloe. It's not showing up on my screen, so you might just want to give me a nudge when you want us to talk through those.
Should be ready now, Siwan. Can you see the results?
No, I can't, sorry, but maybe James would be able to share those.
Yes,
yeah.
Thanks, everyone, and good evening, everybody. My name is James. I can see the results here. So 35% of people have a plan. 27, approximately 30%, plan on creating one soon, and 39% create one. So, these results are actually remarkable, actually, how similar they are to kind of government statistics. The government put out a farm practice survey, asked a random sample of farmers up and down the country how many people have. And yeah. According to that survey, it's approximately 30-35% of people have a plan. Remarkable.
Yeah, so that's really good to see, isn't it, James, that the audience for tonight's webinar are either after a quick refresher on maybe how they can look at improving their nutrient management plan when they review that in the coming few months, and hopefully as well those that are planning on doing one will pick up some good tips from it tonight.
Yeah, so definitely an audience, I think, that are looking to, they're in the right place.
Yeah. So just a note as well on the questions and on the polls, it is all anonymous, so if you do have any questions, please feel free to type those in, and then Chloe will only read out the questions, not the name during the webinar. And same with the rest of the polls, we can't see what you're voting for, so please be honest with us when we're asking the questions. Okay, so we'll move on to the benefits of managing nutrients. So firstly, I just want to cover, we all probably know that grass and forage is a very useful resource that we have on farm, but it can be an overlooked resource. So grass, as either graze grass or grass silage, is the most economical source of feed that we have on farm. So you can see from the graph here that the production cost of graze grass is the cheapest, followed by grass silage, and then the most expensive one is your powder concentrate or your purchase feed that you would buy onto your farm. However, the good news is that managing nutrients correctly on farm does allow us to improve growth and quality of grass. And this means that we can reduce our reliance on that expensive purchase concentrate, which can lead to a potential cost saving for the business. While we also improve grass growth and grass quality by improving our management of nutrients, there is a follow-on effect of pasture utilisation improvements. And what I mean by pasture utilisation is how much of that grass the animal eats and then converts into milk or meat. And if we can improve pasture utilisation by 1 tonne per hectare, this is worth an additional profit of £204 a hectare for a beef and sheep farm and £334 per hectare for a dairy farm. The next benefit of managing on-farm nutrients is that we actually realise that they are a valuable source of nutrients. So on-farm manures, so farmyard manures or slurry, should not be seen as a waste product because they do contain valuable nutrients. So the next few slides, I'm just going to try and give you an example of how we can put a value on farmyard manures or slurry. So in this example, to begin with, we are going to look at a typical 6% dry matter cattle slurry. The figures that I'm going to show you now have been taken from the Nutrient Management Guide RB209, and all of these guides are available on AHDB's webpage, and Chloe might pop a link in the chat box for you now, but there will also be a link to where these can be downloaded in the follow-up email after the webinar. So an application of 30 cubic meters per hectare of 6% dry matter cattle slurry is worth £92.40 per hectare. So those of you that might like the detail behind this calculation, we can talk through this in the table here. So you'll see the first column over here, and hopefully you can see my mouse, that we've got the elements. So this figure that's been calculated here, it's based on the value of the nitrogen, phosphate and potash within the cattle slurry. In the next column, we've got the total nutrient content, and these figures are taken on the typical what we'd expect to see for a 6% dry matter cattle slurry from the Nutrient Management Guide. However, it is important to note that the total nutrient content is not all available, hence why we've got the availability in the next column here in percentage. So if we look at the first row, which is the nitrogen, we'll see that the available nitrogen from the total nutrient content is 45%. And this is based on a spring application through a shallow injected technique and on any soil types. So it's important to note that your availability of nitrogen will differ depending on season, method of application and soil types. Within the section 2 of the AHDB Nutrient Management Guide that I've mentioned that we'll circulate the links to, there is different scenarios based on different seasons, applications and soils for you to be able to take that number from. So why is the total nitrogen not available? Why is it only 45%? Well, the reason for this is that nitrogen is a so-called mobile element, which means that it is lost out of the soil. So it leaches out of the soil, meaning that all of the nitrogen applied is actually not available for that grass to take care of. So you can see that the available nitrogen content is then 45% of the total nutrients, giving us 1.2. We've then worked out that the nitrogen cost per kilogram of nitrogen is 60p. And based on this figure, the slurry value for nitrogen is 86p. You can see then that we've got similar values for phosphate and potash in the table here, again with total nutrient availability. One thing to note here is that whilst nitrogen is calculated on the available nutrient content, phosphate and potash are calculated on the total nutrient content, even though they're not 100% available. And the reason for this is that phosphate and potash have a binding capacity to soil. So they will bind to soil, and even though they're not available for that crop to take up those nutrients, it will be there for the next grass crop, for example. So it's technically money in the bank via the soil. Okay, so if we then give an example of the value in farmyard manure, this example is based on a typical 25% dry matter cattle farmyard manure. And if we applied 20 tonnes per hectare, this is worth £158.40 per hectare. Again, for those that like the details, we've got a similar table here. The figures again are taken from the Nutrient Management Guide. And one thing to bring your attention to is the availability for nitrogen here is 10%. And this is based on a spring application of old farmyard manure to all soil types. So the definition of old farmyard manure, excuse me, is anything that's been in a muck heap for +3 months. So in the Nutrient Management Guide, you do have availability of nitrogen for fresh and old farmyard manure. And also, again, as with slurry, this availability will change depending on season and method of application and soil type. So those figures in those tables are based on typical values. If you want to go a step further and actually find out the values for your own slurry or farmyard manure, we do have how to sample videos to show you how to do this safely, especially when it comes to sampling slurry. And these are available on AHDB's YouTube channel. Again, the links will be circulated to you if you want to take a look at those. Another benefit, as well as improving profitability of managing our nutrients, is the benefit that it can have on the reducing environmental impact. So careful planning that maximise the efficiency of fertiliser use and better management of manures can help reduce the amount of nitrogen that is lost as nitrous oxide. So nitrous oxide is 300 times more potent than carbon dioxide. And it's important to mention here in regard to managing nutrients, as the source of nitrous oxide is from grazing returns, storage and application of farm nutrients and nitrogen fertiliser. Another thing to mention on the reducing the environmental impacts is that losses from application of manufactured fertilisers and manures can contribute to diffuse water pollution, and can also mean that we're losing valuable nutrients and money from our soils. So if you're planning on managing your nutrients and you're planning to make a plan, it does encourage you to avoid building up nutrients in the soil above the target index, which is 2, 2- for potash, and applying fertiliser in small amounts rather in a single large dressing is also supported in the Nutrient Management Guide, and that will also help reduce environmental impacts. Okay, so before we move on to our next poll for the evening, I just want to touch on actually now thinking about either reviewing or creating a nutrient management plan. So it's important to set aside some time to plan for next year, and during the winter is a perfect time to start that planning and ready for spring, when we will start seeing grass growing. So there's 2 steps to get you started with planning your nutrient management or reviewing a nutrient management plan. And the first one is to check how up to date your soil tests are. So soil should be sampled and analysed every 3 to 5 years, and sampling 25% of your field each year is an efficient way of maintaining this schedule. So have a look at your soil test results, and if they're more than 4 years old, then plan to take a sample next year, so either in the spring or autumn. And when taking samples, it's important to try and take these in the same season every time. Your soil test results will provide you with information on phosphates, potash, magnesium, and crucially pH that will help you then formulate your nutrient management plan. You can also pay for more extensive soil tests that will give you information on soil organic matter and a lot more indicators if you wish, but the basics one will give you the information that you need to start your nutrient management planning. So once you've checked and you're satisfied with your soil test results, the next step is to ask yourself, well, how well or not so well, maybe for some this year, did grass grow? The reason to ask yourself this is when we're thinking of applying potash and phosphates, we should make some tweaks to the application if we grew less grass than we expected. And this is because, especially in a silage field, if we are taking off less of the crop than what we might have expected to grow, we would have taken less phosphate and potash from that field in that grass. So again, the AHDB nutrient management guide does provide typical values for offtakes, and you can use those to help you determine where you're at with your yield that you did grow this year.
Siwan, we've just got a quick question.
Yeah, go.
How early in spring would you sample permanent grassland?
Yeah, so the key with soil sampling is to do it. I'm not going to give you a date because it'll be different for everyone depending on your location and your soil type. But the key is to test soil when it's, it's not waterlogged completely and it's not bone dry. So it is when in the spring we say when it's starting to dry up a little bit, and in the autumn we would say when it's starting to dampen a little bit. So not a straightforward answer there, but try and avoid in the spring if it's still raining a lot and that you're seeing puddles of water on the field as well. It's better to wait for it to dry up a little bit. Probably around March, April. Our second poll, if you don't mind launching that for me, please, Chloe. So the question is, what do you use to create your nutrient management plan? So the options are Excel, tried and tested, planning programs such as Gatekeeper, or I haven't made a plan yet. We'll just give you some time to get your answers in. Perfect, thanks, Chloe. So the results are in. Apologies, it's really small on my screen, so I might not get the figures 100%. So the majority of people have said that they haven't made a plan yet, but of those that have, the majority have used Excel at 23%, I think, followed by Planet. And is it then planning programs such as Gatekeeper and then tried and tested?
Yeah.
So there's 2 options for creating a nutrient management plan. So there is just using your Excel sheets, and if you know where to get the information and you're quite happy in how to calculate the recommendations yourself, then Excel can be a good option. Another way, if you prefer the paper-based option, is the tried and tested. Again, these are paper-based, so they're on the computer if you like, and these are free sheets, and there is also supporting information that can be downloaded from www.nutrientmanagement.org. And these include farm and field record sheets for you to fill in, and they have been told by farmers that have used them that they are quite straightforward to use. So I definitely recommend having a look at tried and tested if you haven't done a plan before. And then, as James mentioned, there is also a number of software packages that can help you plan your nutrient use. Some of them have also got other functions, and you might wish to tie in a few of those together, which is a good option for some. An app, and the name of this app, you'll never forget it, is the Farm Crap app, and this is free to download from Apple and Android stores, I believe. And this is really useful because it works without signal, so it works offline, and it'll update when you're out in the field as well. And it also tells you the nutrient content of manures, and you're able to take a picture of your application rate if you like, and compare that to visual photos and assessments through the app. And you can then, the aim of that is to help you to change your application rate if you think that you're then applying too much when you're out in the field doing this. So if there's any more questions on the tools available, Chloe, we might come back to them when James has joined us on the phone, if that's okay.
Yes, we've got a couple, but I'll leave them till the end when James is back.
Yeah,
yep.
Perfect, thank you. Okay, so if I carry on to the next section, which is the principles of nitrogen management and how we can use these to our advantage on farm. So the aim in any farming system, so if you're beef and sheep or a dairy farmer, the aim is to maximise the meat or milk produced from grass and forage. And efficient production and utilisation is needed. So it's important for us to match the grass supply, which is the green line here on the graph, and the livestock feed demand. So how much grass you need to feed your animals through the year. Okay, that's better. So the important thing here is to come back to actually understanding how much grass or forage you need. And once you've got that idea of how much you need, you can then strategically use nitrogen to boost yield where needed. But the important point to remember also is that there's no point just growing more grass if it physically cannot be eaten. Nitrogen is good to help boost that grass supply if needed, as the investment for fertiliser nitrogen compared to bought-in nitrogen in the form of purchased concentrate in the winter is at least 3 to 1. So again, it links back to that cost-saving potential. So only grow what is needed, and the aim of this graph is just to show that nitrogen is a very important nutrient for grassland because it has such a strong effect on yield. So generally, 1 kilogram of nitrogen will grow between 10 and 15 kilograms of grass dry matter in older swards. And then in any new layers, so anything less than 10 years of age that are high performing, the response is between 15 and 25 kilograms dry matter to that 1 kilogram of nitrogen. However, just a word of caution that too much nitrogen produces grass with low sugar levels, and any resulting silage produced from that grass can have high ammonia and butyric acid levels, making that silage less palatable to stock. In addition, as we've already discussed, nitrogen is a mobile element and it does tend to leach from the soil. So there's no point adding more on just to lose that, and also to reduce the water quality in your catchment. So coming back to how do we assess grass growth, and this will help you understand how much grass you're currently supplying and how far or how much above your herd or flock demand is that actually supplying you on farm. It's also really useful when we're talking about nitrogen to have an understanding of your grass growth or your target growth, and because the recommendations in the nutrient management guide are based on yields, and I will give an example of that at the end of the presentation. So there's various methods that we can use to measure grass, and from the simple way of using your welly booth to the sward stick. And the most common way on farm is to use a rising plate meter, but also some people do prefer to cut a quadrant, weigh that grass, and use a average dry matter for that region, which can be accessible through the likes of Forage for Knowledge or Grass Check GB, which I'll also mention on the next slide. However, if you're not measuring grass at the moment and thinking that you need something a little bit less labour intensive, there is new technology coming out on the market in terms of satellite measuring, and there's various commercial companies that now offer this service and getting good results. It's also important that we take into account how much silage that we're producing. So there's various options to assess the yield, from counting bales and trailers to using weigh bridges, or again using a small quadrant and assessing the dry matter. So I did mention Forage for Knowledge and Grass Check GB there for your dry matter values if you prefer to do the cut in the quadrant. But also both of these surveys that are updated weekly through the grazing season provide you with data to either use to assess how grass is growing, to decide if fertilizer should be applied, and also gives you something to benchmark your production against. To help you calculate your herd demand, AHDB's feed and forage calculator would help you do this in a quick and simple way. It's an Excel sheet, and it calculates depending on the number of stock and the number of weeks, for example. So this is based for winter feeding, but you can use it to calculate that over the year as well. And it might show you that you have a herd or flock demand that is higher than the grass you're currently growing, and that might be nitrogen might be an option to fill that gap if you've looked at all the other options. Okay, so once we know how much grass we need to grow, we will then have a crop requirement. But before we then go out and buy that bag of nitrogen fertilizer, it's important to take into account 4 things. So there will be a supply of nitrogen from soil mineral nitrogen, the supply from manures. So as we talked through in the tables at the beginning of the presentation, there is nitrogen in slurry and farmyard manure, and we must take that value into consideration when we're assessing how much nitrogen we're applying to the crop. Supply from air. So nitrogen is deposited from the air, similar to how sulfur was supplied in a constant and automatic form from sulfur dioxide emissions until 1990s. Obviously now there is a requirement to apply sulfur to grassland as well, especially if we're using a lot of nitrogen. And lastly, it's important to take into account the amount of nitrogen that is supplied from clover. So you'll see the various different clover content in the pictures here. And if we look at the top one, which is 20 to 30% of clover, which is the recommended rate of clover in a ley for you to get a benefit for nitrogen supplying from the nitrogen fixation from the clover, you can see that 20 to 30% would potentially supply nitrogen at 180 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare. So once you've calculated this out, you know then how much you need to top up using a nitrogen from the bag of what you've bought onto farm. So I promised earlier that I'd quickly show you how nitrogen recommendations come in the nutrient management guide. So I've taken the example here for grass silage, and you can see that in the first column, it does expect you to use your target annual dry matter yield for grass. So in the example in the green box here, you can see that if our target annual grass production is between 7 and 9 tons dry matter, the total nitrogen supply recommendation is 130 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare per year. And that is split across the first and second cut. So 80 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare before first cut, followed by the top up of 50 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare before the second cut. If you were aiming to produce more grass, so here in the box between 9 and 12 tons, you can see that your overall total nitrogen applied should be higher at 250 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare. And if you, in this situation, are going to take 3 cuts of silage, then there would be that application is split across these. And you can see that for the first cut and second cut, that these are higher than what we had in the previous example. So there is a table like this for grazing as well in the nutrient management guide, and again that does work on target annual yield, and again it is splitting that total nitrogen applied into smaller and more frequent applications. If you would like more information on how to use the nutrient management guide and these tables, I would highly recommend a previous webinar on how to use the nutrient management guide RB209. And again, I think Chloe's just popped a link to that in the chat. It is definitely worth having a bit of a listen to that one to help you navigate your way around these tables. So to conclude the presentation part of tonight, before we open the floor to more discussion, I would like just to conclude by going through the key take-home messages. So the benefit of nutrient management is that it offers us an opportunity to maximise homegrown forage. It also highlights that we should be making more use of on-farm nutrients that are high value. And it also provides an opportunity to improve and support clean air and water. Now is the time to plan. So have a look at your soil test, update these if needed. So if they're over 4 years of age, look at starting to plan when you're going to soil test to get those recent results ready to go. Assess your grassland production and take the time to plan. So over winter now is the perfect time to plan. So we're ready to go in 2021 in the spring with a plan that will bring in the benefits. And then the last box on here is just coming back to that demand versus supply. So making sure that we understand how much of a grass and forage demand that we have from the stock, and also how much that we're supplying. And looking at how much nitrogen do we actually need to use to achieve that target. And the last point is only grow what you can efficiently utilise, otherwise it will be a waste. So before we kick off the discussion, we've got our final poll of the evening, and this is just around what follow-on webinars would you be interested in attending around this topic area. So we've got a few options on the screen. The first one is step-by-step, creating a nutrient management plan, understanding your soil test analysis, grass and forage, calculating current growth and requirements, muck and slurry, storage, spreading method, and nutrient value. And we'll give you a few seconds to cast your votes. Okay, I think the results are coming in now. So the majority would like to see a step-by-step in creating a nutrient management plan, followed by, oh, I think that's the muck and slurry one after, isn't it, Chloe?
Yes, that's right.
Yeah, perfect. And then understanding your soil analysis, and then grass and forage, understanding growth and measurements. Perfect. Thank you very much for responding to those polls. We will take those offline to discuss and hopefully tick some of those boxes for you in the new year. And I'll hand over to you for questions, Chloe, and hopefully we've got James on the phone as well.
Thanks, Siwan. And thank you everyone for bearing with us with the technology issues. We do always test it beforehand, so just want to apologise and thank you all for your patience this evening. James, you're with us, but I think you're on mute. I'll kick us off with the first question, Siwan. I think you'll be what are the potential issues with sampling soil in midwinter? Which parameter are you suggesting may be incorrect?
Sorry, Chloe, I missed that. Was it trampling of soil?
Sorry, what are the potential issues with sampling soil midwinter? And is there a particular parameter that might be incorrect if you sample at this time?
Yeah, so as I mentioned before, you're better to wait until the spring or in the autumn before it gets too wet to sample your soil. The main reason for this is that water in the soil will cause the elements that we're looking into, so your phosphate, your potash and your magnesium and pH might not be accurate due to that amount of water that we would be seeing in the soil. So definitely recommend waiting until the spring if possible to get those soil tests done.
Thank you. And James, if you're able to chat, we've just got a question. The Planet software, is that free to download and use? It says you're unmuted, but we can't hear you.
James, you might just want to, on your laptop, change to phone call. If you click the orange arrow, click down on audio and then press phone call.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
Wow. Okay. Sorry about this, everyone. Chloe's absolutely right. We did test this earlier. I think my kids have since gone online and are streaming 2 movies at the same time as me on go-to webinars. And I just don't think the broadband in my area can deal with it. So apologies for that. It's absolutely my fault. I've just tried to speak to the kids and asked them not to do that, and I won't repeat what they said. Sorry. Could you repeat the question, Siwan? Apologies for this.
Yeah, it's just the Planet software, James. Is that free to download and use?
Yeah, absolutely it is. It's available through ADAS. If you Google Planet Manure MPK, it will take you to the website. The only thing to note is that since AHDB has been publishing RB209, we've updated the system of grassland recommendations, but the ADAS and DEFRA haven't updated the Planet software. So the system of calculating the nutrient requirements and fertilizer application for grassland is slightly different to RB209 as it currently stands. It's based on the edition that was published in 2010. generally speaking, the result is the same. Actually, when AHDB published RB209, we changed the system just to make it a little bit more straightforward, remove some of the steps. The answer that you get is, broadly speaking, the same, but it's just something to be aware of. The system within Planet is slightly different than you will see in the RB209 that AHDB publishes, but it's free to download.
Thanks, James. The next question is, do we know, we could direct this person, what is the capital cost and operating cost of storing and applying livestock manure?
Wow. Okay. So the values that I've shared with you tonight are just the values of the nutrients within that farmyard manure. So we haven't taken into account the cost of storing or applying that to land. On the storage cost, I haven't got an answer for that tonight. I don't know if you have, James, but if not, I'm happy to look into that. Chloe, if you might just note that person's name and email address, we'll get back to them. But again, on the application and the method they use, it will differ as well, depending on machinery. But I was recently talking to someone on the application of nitrogen fertilizer. So that would have been bag fertilizer, and they would have priced that at £13 per hectare. So not answering your farmyard manure, but that would give you an idea on the applying nitrogen.
Yeah, I guess it depends entirely on the type of material. If you're storing, if you're, there are costs associated with most things, and there's costs associated with field heaps in terms of management and hours of work. But that's obviously going to be much greater if you're storing slurry and needing to store slurry for months on end. John Nix, the farm management handbook, will be able to give you average values. So if you're looking to essentially kind of business planning, they will have average values, but fairly accurate values to help you do that as well. So John Nix is something to look at potentially.
Thanks, James. The next question, Siwan, what tool would you recommend for a dairy farm which aims to get the most out of their grazing first time setup? So I think they're referring to the grass and measuring tools.
Yeah, so again, similar to how we've described the ones available for the nutrient management, there is various commercial softwares available from AgriNet, which is popular here in GB, to also another software called Farmax, and AgriWeb as well do offer this service. So I'd recommend having a chat to a few people just to get their opinion. If you know someone that's using one of them, it would be really good just to get their views on it and what they find useful, and maybe what are the downsides of them as well. So again, there's pros and cons to various softwares. They generally tend to be quite cheap, so it's an annual subscription that you would pay for. And by monitoring and measuring that grass, you definitely get that return on investment in the software over that year. Sorry, Chloe, just to add on that, if you do want to have a little bit of a nose into maybe what they look like, on AHDB, beef and lamb and dairy, there is some previous webinars with AgriNet. I've demonstrated how to use the software, so it might be worth having a look and then to have a bit of a nose to see what they look like.
Thanks, Siwan. Next question is, at what times of year does nitrogen from Clover become available?
Sorry, just writing one of those questions down. So, so Clover has a slightly different growth curve to what we see with grass. So grass swards generally tend to grow once we've got soil temperatures over 5 degrees for a period of consecutive days. So over a week, we see grass growing then. For the clover to start growing, it is a little bit later in the season. And the benefit of having clover, as well as the nitrogen fixation, is that we do see that clover can be beneficial in swards as would other herbs as well, be in a period of dry weather. So it does tend to keep the grass growth curve a little bit higher through the summer. In terms of starting to fix nitrogen, it would be as soon as you see clover within that sward. Obviously, if you've got a new lay with clover, it does take a little bit of time for the clover contents to reach what you would be aiming for, and so it's worth bearing that in mind as well. But that for the 20 to 30% clover in your lay, the 180 kilograms of nitrogen supplied is over the period of the year. So it's worth bearing that in mind, that it's not, you know, all there at the beginning and then gone. It's just spread out, and the 180 is the overall.
Thanks, Siwan. And on that subject, does nitrogen from clover leach, and how does it get used up throughout the growing season?
It's a good question. So the key with using clover to replace bag nitrogen is, you know, it is more, as I've said, that constant fixation of nitrogen and that supply. So you'd like to think that as that nitrogen is fixated by the clover, the plant would use it up. So that constant supply would be used up straight away. In terms of leaching, I think the issue would come if you're not taking into account the amount of nitrogen being supplied from the clover and topping up. So if we're oversupplying and the grass cannot use all the nitrogen in the soil, we will then see leaching. Again, if we have a lot of rainfall, the water again would increase the leaching out of the soil. James, I'm not sure if you wanted to add anything.
No, it's a good answer.
Thanks both. I've got a comment here that within calculations, there needs to be an understanding of utilisation efficiency on each farm. Do you have a comment?
Is that the calculation on the nutrients, on the slurry and farmyard manure? Utilisation, sorry, Chloe, I'm not understanding that question. Is that
so within the calculations for your nutrients, there's just a comment here that there surely needs to be an understanding of the utilisation efficiency on each farm. Do you have any thoughts?
Siwan, would you like me to attempt to answer that? So the recommendation systems take into account soil type. So, for example, the scenario Siwan gave earlier for farmyard manure and slurries, there's a total content of nutrients. What's actually available, say, in terms of nitrogen, depends on the type of application method, but also the soil type as well. And so the recommendation system's obviously not able to take account of every single different farm situation, but over a number of years, we've conducted and with partners conducted a whole range of different trials on different soil types across different farms, and those values are they're consistently good values to use as average values for the availability of the nutrients applied in that way on those soil types.
Thanks, James. We've got a couple more clover questions. So what is the effect of nitrogen application on nitrogen fixing capabilities of legumes?
It's a good question again. I'm sure there is research out there that shows this. I don't know the figures off the top of my head, but again, it is, why would you want to apply that nitrogen if you've already got that clover fixing that nitrogen within the lay? So it's definitely coming back to, if you have clover, try and estimate as accurately as possible what is that clover content, and take the nitrogen supply from that clover into account. Because if you're just adding fertiliser and not trusting the clover to fixate that nitrogen for you, you are wasting money.
Yeah, the nitrogen fertiliser, the manufactured nitrogen, will inhibit the fixation by clover as well. So, I mean, not only do you not need to apply that nitrogen, but can have a detrimental effect. It can also, it'll inhibit clover, but stimulate grass growth as well. So it'll be counterproductive in both ways and shade out the clover.
Thanks both. Just going back to the previous question on utilisation, this person was referring to the amount of forage grown. Only a percentage will be used. Just to go back on that question.
Yeah, I thought that was the question, and that's why I wasn't too clear, Chloe. Because obviously we are talking about what value is actually in that slurry, compared to bagged fertilizer. So in those calculations, he's correct, or she's correct in saying that we hadn't taken into account the forage utilisation, but it was just a comparison of what the slurry and the value of that slurry equates to if you were buying that in a bagged form. So yeah, sorry, I'm happy to take that offline if they want to have a discussion, but I'm not quite sure. Yeah.
Thank you. The next one, clover again, is do different types of clover, so e.g. red versus white, have different levels of nitrogen fixing?
Yeah, so clover's a popular question tonight, so there is a clover webinar that I should mention that Chloe held earlier in the summer, with focusing on a lot more on clover in detail. So Chloe, might be worth adding that link to the email if people are interested. So there is a difference between white clover and the figures that I showed you on that picture. So when I've been mentioning 20 to 30% of clover in the sward, giving you 180 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare, and that is based on white clover. Red clover would give you a little bit more, and the values that we tend to use is around 250 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare.
Thank you. We've got a question here. They're carrying out multi-cut system this year. They have access to Digestate along with their own slurry. When would you recommend to spread Digestate? Is it before cutting, between cuts, or after cuts?
So I would just mention to begin with that it's important to get that analysed, or to get the analysed, so you know exactly what you're dealing with in terms of how much nutrients that you're applying. If you are going to apply that before you cut, you should make sure that you've got a long enough window for the grass to use that up to not affect the palatability of your silage. So I'd suggest, you need a window of 6 to 8 weeks before, if you go before. During, if you're doing multi-cut, would probably not be long enough for that to be used up by the plant. And if you're doing after, you would then be, stocking up for next year. So it depends on what else you've got available, but the key there is not to go between, because it probably wouldn't give you enough days for the plant to use it. And if you go before, just allow enough time for that to not affect the palatability of the grass.
Thank you. The next question is, has any work been done on applying liquid N instead of bagged N to grassland? Are there any benefits or not?
I'm sure there is a lot of work going on around this, because as we all know, nitrogen has, there's interest around nitrogen in terms of environmental impact as well. James, I'm not sure if you know of any that off the top of your head, but if not, I'm happy to have a look into that, Chloe.
Yeah, I'm afraid I don't know the answer to that question. It's not something that we've looked at AHDB, but Siwan, you're absolutely right. I would imagine there there is information on that. Yeah, we can take a look at that and provide some guidance. Yeah.
Thanks both. Next question now on measuring grass. How good are the satellite measuring systems for measuring grass growth?
So yeah, as I mentioned, a few more have come available this year actually, and I know of a few more that will become commercially available next year. Again, there's various variation between them. So the ones that I have seen that have been ground truth, so they've been compared to plate meter readings, and they are really good because you not only have the satellite imaging and determining that grass growth, they've also got a grass growth model built in behind them, which is really important because as we all know, we tend to have quite a few cloudy days in the UK, which can affect how often we get the readings. So I would say that if you are at the moment that you're measuring grass with a plate meter or another way every week, you probably wouldn't get sufficient data through the satellite at this moment in time. But if you're looking for something to maybe provide grass growth data every 2 weeks, then it might be something for you to look into. But very interesting and very exciting developments going on around that precision tech to help us manage grassland going forward.
Thanks, Siwan. The next question is, what is the best method to make a long-term corrective action for P&K Index 1 on fields that are continuously used for 2 cuts of silage to increase these indexes?
Okay, so it'd be quite interesting to know what long term is. So is that just since the last soil test, or is that been a few soil tests after each other? Again, the soil type would be quite useful to know in that scenario. It is really good to look at building index to have a look and maybe analyse your farm nutrients. So if you've got slurry or farmyard manure, analyse them and actually find out how much P&K you've got, and maybe look at building it up via using what you've got on farm, and then topping that up with purchased fertiliser. So the reason we tend to say that soil tests should be done every 3 to 5 years is that it does take that long to change an index. So you're not going to see that change overnight. And so just bear that in mind as well, that if you start on that process to improve that index, it's going to take you probably 3 years to see that coming through in a soil test results. James, I'm not sure if you've got anything to add on that one.
No, it's absolutely. The only thing I would add is the recommendations in RB 209 for those indices at 0 and 1. You're essentially applying a little bit more than the crop needs each year, say, or each application, and the idea is that you build up over a period of time. There is some guidance in RB 209 if you wanted to accelerate that, which I think is the kind of the gist of the question, and you can increase that as well. It would depend on a field by field basis, but obviously if it's a sloping field and there's a brook or a river at the bottom, obviously you need to be cautious about applying too much fertilizer, particularly at certain times of year when potentially that could wash off the surface if it was to rain the next day perhaps. But absolutely there is guidance within RB 209 in terms of kind of like ramping it up and then achieving or getting to target and a more optimal level quicker. As Siwan says, it's going to take you some time, maybe perhaps even 10 years to achieve that at index 0. So if you want to perhaps get there quicker, then you can do that. And of course, different types of materials have different amounts of phosphate in, for example. So you might not have this option, but biosolids are rich in phosphate, and if that was something that you would consider, obviously there's considerations in terms of how long or how much time you give then before you cut the grass, but potentially an opportunity to apply biosolids that's rich in phosphate and that build up your indices perhaps quicker to 2.
Thanks, James. This next question might be for you. What is the best way, how much nitrogen from slurry is mineralized and when is it available?
Yes, that's a good question. So I think the question is we saw in the example that Siwan gave that potentially only 45% of the nitrogen is available. It's not the 55% of nitrogen is not necessarily going to leach it. You potentially will lose some of that perhaps over the next winter, but it's not all necessarily going to disappear, and it's going to be in that organic form and become mineralized over time. It's really variable. It depends, and it's kind of like scientists like myself use this as a kind of get out of jail card. I know quite often it depends on this and it depends on that, but it's really true. It's quite hard to make estimates of that. Essentially, we don't include those in nutrients balance calculations. So while the phosphate and potash in an organic material will be will become available pretty predictably to a crop, the amount of nitrogen that becomes available is quite uncertain, and so essentially you're starting from scratch each year, which presents its challenges, because clearly over time, if you have regular applications of organic materials, if you're regularly applying Farmyard, Manure, or biosolids, compost, that is going to build your soil organic matter levels, and you're going to have an increase in the mineralization of nitrogen. I would say over time, that's going to improve your soil, and you will start to get a feel for how much of that nitrogen is available, and over time perhaps you'll be able to scale back on your nitrogen applications, because you're able to recognize that you're perhaps, for example, technically moving from a low to a moderate or high SNS index, but it's quite hard to be really prescriptive on that. It's something that you gain an understanding for over time.
Thank you, James. We've got a question here about a new clover lay in the spring. Which would be better to apply, cattle manure or chicken manure to this lay?
We're getting into the specifics now, Chloe. I would my first instinct, James, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that the chicken manure would be probably higher in nitrogen, which would mean
absolutely.
that would then stimulate the grass within that sward at the beginning of the season, which might mean that it would choke your clover out. So for a new lay especially, it's probably best to go with your cattle manure, but just be aware again of how much nitrogen that you're putting on there. And if you're talking about a grass lay with the normal amount of clover in, so your 20 to 30%, there is recommendations in the AHDB Nutrient Management Guide RB209 on how much nitrogen to apply to those new lays in the first year as well.
Thanks, Siwan.
Yeah. I think I think the clover is particularly vulnerable. I think is perhaps the right word in that first year as it establishes as well. And I think in RB209 we actually don't recommend using any nitrogen then at all. But Siwan's absolutely right. Perhaps later in the year as well, or later in the rotation, if you have that option, it's not necessarily about what type of material, but perhaps how much you're applying. So not all manures are created equal, and coming from different animals, if you like, be that a hen or a cattle or even, dare I say it, human, it has a different nutrient content on, per ton, for example. Get an analysis if you can. Perhaps that comes with the material, or if you have this material, take a sample it and send that to a lab and try to understand how much nitrogen is that, and then balance that with your recommendation.
Thanks, James. And what can be done to reduce the loss of N in farmyard manure?
Yeah, so again, it is about storing. There's various things that you can do at storage to try and reduce how much nitrogen is lost, and also thinking about the season of application and how you maybe incorporate that into the soil. So it is the more that you can do to apply at the right time, store at the right time, using the correct application method will help you reduce how much nitrogen is lost. Also, weather conditions play a big part in that as well. So it's all about maximising those best practice of storage, applying when the weather in best weather conditions, and also in the season. It does vary between seasons in that availability, so it's worth bearing that in mind as well. I haven't got the figures and how it changes off the top of my head, Chloe. I haven't got the book next to me either. Maybe James knows them.
Yeah, essentially applying in the spring if you can. That's when the crop requires the nitrogen, and it's going to be more readily used by the crop then, so you're going to lose less because it's going to be taken up by the crop. So if you can store it over winter and apply in the spring, and that's pretty much true for all crops, really. Yeah, no matter what you're growing, ideally you want to apply in the spring.
Thanks both. Do you have any views on urea versus ammonium nitrate?
So both have a place within a grassland system. I would say that my views come in on which one you use at certain points of the years is down to the weather. So at the beginning of the season, we do tend to say that you would be better to maybe use urea, and then as the weather gets hotter and drier, it is definitely not worth applying urea in those conditions because it will be lost to the atmosphere. So then switching to your ammonium nitrate.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, really good answer.
Thank you. We've got a couple more Clover questions, so I will send the link to the Clover webinar and get back to you individually on those ones shortly after the webinar. We've just got a couple more on nutrients before we wrap up, if that's all right, both. Question here that they currently grow high levels of red clover in their silage lays, and they've tried growing without nitrogen application, but only to find that the grass growth is poor. Could there be an obvious reason for this?
I would suggest doing checking the soil test. So looking if there's anything else that's currently not adequate in that soil. So your pH, your P's, your K's, your mags. So if you haven't got a recent soil test, or since you've started seeing this happening, it might be worth retesting. And it also might be worth finding the shovel and going out and digging a hole and seeing what's happening in terms of soil structure and soil health as well, because there might be some underlying issues that's not related to what we're applying, but actually the structure or the health of the soil. So be worth having a look at the Healthy Grassland Soils pocketbook. That will talk you through to how to assess the structure, and it might give you, there might be an issue of compaction or something along those lines that's not allowing us to see that as productive as we would have hoped.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Just got 2 more questions left. What are your thoughts on the acidification of slurry with sulfuric acid?
James?
And I'm afraid I don't know. It's not something that I'm overly familiar with. Something that perhaps we can get, I can look into and we can get back to you on.
Yeah, sorry, Chloe, the same answer from me.
Thanks, both. And the final question for this evening, is it possible to remove the need to apply nitrogen with very high white clover content for grazing only?
So 20 to 30% of clover, I don't know what they mean as high, but at that rate, you would get a potential supply of 180 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare. From that table I showed you on the silage, if you're only producing 7 to 9 tons, that would fly over the amount of nitrogen that was recommended for you to supply. So it comes back to, well, what is your target annual yield? And I would like a clarification on what they mean by high clover content. Just a word of warning in regard to animal health, that bloat can be an issue if you have higher, I would say, than 30% of clover in your swards. So, and you have to bear that in mind as well.
Yeah.
Well, thank you. We have reached the end of the questions. I will go back to those couple of people asking about clover and get back to you in the next couple of days. So thank you everyone very much for your participation tonight and helping out with our polls. It's certainly given us some ideas for future webinars. Thank you very much, James and Siwan, for your time this evening.
No problem.
Thank you. And apologies for the technology.
We'll forgive you, James. This presentation has been recorded along with the questions, so if anyone did have any problems earlier, it will be available on the Beef and Lamb and Dairy YouTube channels. So enjoy the rest of your evenings, everyone, and wish you all a Merry Christmas.